We are live streaming on Facebook. We'll also put this recording up on our YouTube channel. And you can, if you miss some of it tonight, or want to share it with friends tomorrow, you can watch it all there. But for tonight, we're bringing you a group of brilliant Joyceans to discuss why read Ulysses 100 years after it was published. And let's begin. Why don't I run through introductions for everybody, and then I'll hand it off to our scholars. Megan Quigley is Associate Professor of English at Villanova University. She's the author of Modernist Fiction and Vagueness, Philosophy, Form, and Language. She's also co-editing the forthcoming volume, Eliot Now, in time for the Centenary of the Wasteland. Paul St. Amour chairs the Department of English at the University of Pennsylvania and is the author most recently of Tense Future, Modernism, Total War, Encyclopedic Form, and the co-editor with Jessica Berman of the Modernist Latitudes series at Columbia University Press. Mac O'Reilly is a senior English major and Irish Studies minor at Villanova University. Quinn Gruber is a senior at the University of Pennsylvania studying English and Italian. Jordan Nicholson is a senior English and philosophy double major with a minor in mathematics at Villanova University. Bonnie Roos is professor of English at West Texas A&M University and is currently developing a weekly chapter-by-chapter podcast scheduled to begin June 16th, exploring how Ulysses helps us think about contemporary issues. And Sean Latham serves as editor of the James Joyce Quarterly and is the director of the TU Institute for Bob Dylan Studies and is the author or editor of 9 books. This is quite a panel, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Why don't I hand it off to you, Megan and Paul, and you guys can take it on from here.
Okay, thank you, Ed, and thank you for the Rosenbach for hosting us for this. Sean, come back to us one day. So I wanted to also say a welcome for the Center for Irish Studies at Villanova University, where Mac is one of our Irish Studies minors. Okay, so back in September, Sean, Paul, and I convened to think about an event heralding what it meant to read, teach, and research Ulysses in the year 2022. Both Paul and I pretty frequently teach Ulysses here in Philadelphia, where we are fortunate to have the manuscript at the Rosenbach and where we can bring our students, usually in person, to see for themselves Joyce's elaborate visions and many, many revisions. This spring, celebrating 100 years of the novel's publication, the challenge to teach Ulysses seemed a little bit more insurmountable to me than usual. So it wasn't just the usual, which is Joyce's mocking voice in my head saying, you all know this one, I've put in so many enigmas and puzzles that it will keep the professors busy for centuries arguing over what I meant, and that's the only way of ensuring one's immortality. Although that mocking voice is ever louder now that a century has passed, and I'm uncomfortably one of those professors. But no, the difficulty in teaching it also was that it seemed too hard. But what I mean by that is too long for students still struggling with a pandemic and the daily difficulties that posed. Also unaccustomed to the longer reading assignments required for this from virtual classes, which have been going on for a long time. Too overwhelmingly Eurocentric, as we strive to decolonize the curriculum in more than buzzwords. Too racist or misogynist in sections where even if the text might be working to question racism and misogyny, I wasn't sure it was doing it successfully. At the same time, teaching Joyce's monster novel seemed more urgent. And as we read it, this work so beautifully questions false patriotism, violence, anti-Semitism, gendered labor, and the powers of rhetoric. Could those points that seem so important to me still resonate with my students today? So we convene this roundtable to think about what it means to read and to teach Ulysses today, both for students and for the teachers, for common readers, first-time readers, but also for those of us returning to it during a pandemic, what it's like. So I also just wanted to make sure I ended by saying I am so grateful to each and every one of you that are participating. It's our final week of classes here at Villanova. There's a lot going on, and I'm so grateful that you're all here. I'll pass it to Paul.
Hi, everybody. I also want to echo Megan's thanks to the Rosenbach and to our participants, and of course to you, the audience. And we intend for you audience members to become participants in the latter half of this conversation. So as you're listening to our speakers, be formulating questions that come up for you, or your own answers to the question, why read Ulysses 100 years on? Why are you reading it 100 years on, or thinking about reading it, or regretting having read it, etc. So we want to get you in on the action. And when it comes time for us to welcome your questions, we're going to ask that you do it using the chat function, that you either type your question into the chat or just indicate in the chat that you have a question. You can just say, I have a question. And when we get to you, I will ask Ed to unmute you, and then you can ask your question with your own voice. We're not able in this format to unmute your video, so it'll just be your voice speaking from the disembodied dark, but there's something maybe appropriate in a book so full of voices, embodied and disembodied. All right, what we're going to do is go in the order of the speakers that Ed introduced, and then we're going to ask the speakers to address one another's comments for a little bit, and then throw it up into questions. So without further ado, let's turn things over to Mac.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mac O'Reilly. I'm a senior English major at Villanova, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm also an Irish Studies minor. So hello to Dr. Joyce. I saw you on this. I see you on the attendees there, so it's good to see you here. So when I was asked the question, why read Ulysses 100 years out, my first answer actually is to open up discussions about womanhood and femininity. And you might be thinking, that's a little odd because the story itself follows two men trying to discover what it means to be a man, or what it feels like to be masculine, or yes, just finding out who they want to be as a man. But I think another question that comes up is, why would a 22-year-old woman of the 21st century care what a middle-aged man of the 20th century has to say about women? And at first I would have been like, probably nothing. But then I read Penelope in these past few weeks, and we discussed it in class this week. And I think that there are two ways to look at Penelope from a feminist standpoint. So first of all, you can look at Penelope first as describing a female character. Molly simply being one character. There is just a single perspective that is being described by Joyce in that sense. So Joyce in that way can put his own characteristics onto Molly, and it's not like it's describing all of women, it's just describing Molly. And some might say like, oh, she's too sexual this, or oh, she's too sexual that, but I'm sure all of you at one point have had a friend that has opened up a little too much about what went on in their love life, or on that last Tinder date, or whatever date that they just went on. So I personally find Molly to be someone relatable and familiar. But the other way to look at Penelope is to see it as a way that Joyce defines women as a group and as beings themselves. And you might be thinking like, why would you want to know that sort of information? In most of my English classes here, I've been looking at how women are described by other women. And what the fascinating thing here is you get a unique perspective on what a woman is from a man. And this is a description of a raw, real, and unromanticized woman. At least I'm giving Joyce the benefit of the doubt right there, saying that he is trying to describe just a woman, just your average woman. And whether or not he does it well or not, it is a unique perspective to add on to the discussion of what is a woman, or how do we perceive women. And it brings up a lot of interesting questions, such as what parts appear to be accurate that he describes, what parts are problematic, how do we change this perspective that men have of women? And where do we progress from here? Do we continue to try and tweak how each gender perceives each other as either masculine or feminine? Or do we try and push beyond these bounds to focus more on defining what a human is? Like, do we maintain these categories of gender anymore? Or do we try and just define humanity? So that's what I think is important about Joyce today. And I think that I hope you guys have some questions on that and are thinking about what I just put out there. But thank you for having me on here. And I look forward to listening to the rest of the speakers.
Thanks so much, Mac. We're going to turn now to Quinn Gruber. Hi, Quinn.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Paul and Megan, for inviting us all together. I'm really excited to talk about why Ulysses is such a fantastic book. I think for me, what really has made Ulysses relevant is the way it talks about disability. So for a bit of background, I have something called strabismus, which is like a misalignment of the eyes, and it impacts my sight, but I've also really noticed that it's had a social impact. I grew up with a lot of pressure to look normal, quote unquote normal. And so reading Ulysses last year for the first time in Paul's course, I was struck to find a character, Corny Kelleher, who is a police spy in Dublin that has strabismus. And this is the first character I've ever seen in any media that has this disorder that I've had. And over the course of the book, Joyce reckons with how Kelleher's disability impacts the way other people see him. Like one character, Simon Daedalus, thinks that Kelleher, in this funeral they're going to, got them a cheaper and lower quality coach, because he's disabled. And so Ulysses just really stands out to me because it openly reckons with the ways that we make negative assumptions about disabled people. And it just reckons not only with the fact that these stereotypes exist, but just with their impact on the people that have them. Like there's several other characters, like the blind stripling that Bloom walks with in Lestrygonians, and he thinks for a second, that the blind stripling isn't intelligent, and he stops and he thinks, why am I making this assumption about this blind person that he's automatically going to have an intellectual disability? And so Joyce, like throughout the book, engages with ableism and its personal impact, and he himself struggled with his eyesight and eventually went partially blind. So I think he must have experienced a lot of this personally. But even today, in a lot of media, I find that people do not really think about the stereotypes that we hold of disabled people, that like we sometimes assume disability is some sort of moral failing or something that somebody needs to overcome. And Joyce doesn't do that. And that's why I really think that it's still an important book, is that it's thinking about these ideas that even now we hold and need to kind of challenge.
Thanks so much, Quinn. Let's turn now to Jordan Nicholson. Welcome, Jordan.
Hi all, thank you very much. I'm also very excited to be here. So for our class with Dr. Quigley this semester,
It's a very Joycean moment to have a knocking at the door, and you have to decide if you're going to put it in the manuscript or not.
I'm sorry about that. I forgot to warn my roommates that I was doing this. But yes, so in our class this semester, we were all assigned a random character and a random episode to present on. And I coincidentally was assigned both Mina Purefoy and Oxen of the Sun. So like I was working with Mina for a lot of this semester, and I really think she is how I found my way into this novel. And like why, like, her character is what makes this feel so contemporary to me. So like, as we've been reading this book just over the course of this semester, there have been, like, within the United States, like, so many, like, abortion restrictions and, like, restrictions on reproductive rights, like, just over the course of, like, the time that it's taken to read this novel. And clearly, like, reproduction and reproductive rights are wrapped up in, like, Mina's entire place within the novel, as we only see her, like, giving birth or being pregnant in labor. And so I think, like, right there, like, is like how she feels very relevant to me. But then also I think, about her voicelessness in the novel, the fact that we only really get to meet Mina through, like, the thoughts and the words of Leopold Bloom as he's expressing, like, sympathy and pity for her. We never get to really hear her own voice, and that also feels very relevant when you think about, like, who is, like, making the legislation that is affecting mostly women, mostly poor women, mostly women of color, in terms of reproduction and abortion. It's not typically those poor, like, women of lower classes that are making the decisions. It is people who are so distant from that experience of being pregnant, or the, like, economic stresses of pregnancy and of labor. So I feel like that voicelessness feels especially contemporary. And then I think also about, like, the line that has stuck with me, like, throughout the reading, throughout my reading of Ulysses, has been Bloom's comment about how Mina has been giving of the breast year after year, all hours of the night. And I think just, like, that, like, stressing of, like, her lack of bodily autonomy, like, literally just existing for nearly a decade, as she's given birth, is it 9-10 times, for so long, has not had control over, like, what her breasts do, like, who they're serving. And then I guess, like, what I really have been thinking about since Easter break when we went home is my dad had told me he just started watching The Handmaid's Tale, which, like, I actually haven't read or watched, but, like, know enough about. And so, like, why when he told me that, we had this really interesting conversation about how a lot of these, like, dystopian stories, especially, like, about women being solely used for their bodies, have become maybe less of a dystopian and maybe closer to reality, which makes me especially think of this scene in Circe where Bloom hallucinates or, like, imagines this black mass being served on, like, Mina's swollen belly. And I think really, like, in that scene, Joyce is, like, asking us how close, like, these dystopias, these, like, horrific, like, moments are to, like, how distant they are to, like, our reality, in a world in which we're not giving reproductive rights, we're not giving bodily autonomy to women, to those giving birth. That's pretty much all I had.
Thank you, Jordan. I imagine that you have a lot to say about that claim of Joyce's that that Oxnam of the Sun is about the crime committed against fecundity by sterilizing the act of coition. So maybe we can get to that in our discussion. Let's turn now to Bonnie Roos. Welcome, Bonnie. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me. It is such a privilege to be on a panel with such smart people and such incredible students. My goodness. I, as a teacher, almost never get to teach Ulysses, but I did teach it as a community group to our local people online during the pandemic, which was a really interesting time to read it. And it was just invites as people wanted to share. And it was the last time I taught it and was absolutely fantastic. And one of the ways that I find it useful to think about this story is not to think about what Joyce intended or what Joyce meant with the story, but to use it as a jumping board. And I'm hearing echoes of this approach in the student comments that we're making about how we think about our world today and the questions we want to ask and the questions that we wrestle with and we grapple with. And so, for example, I come from a very working class area. We're mostly farmers in our area, which is part of the reason I do not teach Ulysses as often as I would like to. And so for me, it's super important that when I do teach this novel, I teach it to the people who live here. And happily, Joyce's Ulysses is such a rich text that it offers us a lot of ways to get into it, including agriculturally. And so we can talk about cattle and we can talk about farming and we can talk about, we can compare the kinds of stories that are going on in teaching, which is another aspect that I really am drawn to. So one of the things that I would just talk about is, for example, in the example of Nestor, which Nestor is typically seen as a blowhard. He is not very entertaining for Stephen to deal with, but Nestor also has good advice. And this is something that, oh, I've had those teachers and I've had those parents where you're frustrated, but you know you're getting good advice at the same time, potentially. And he is very supportive of an Anglophilic view. But one of the things he asks Stephen to do is to write about a pandemic, which is coming through the cattle industry and the cattle and pig industry particularly. All cloven animals, all hoofed animals will be affected. And Joyce is, of course, writing after Ireland's Great Famine of the 1850s, but the hoof and mouth disease is approaching when Joyce writes, and he knows it. And one way of reading Ulysses is a prediction of what will happen. That it doesn't happen because vaccines are invented, but it still exists. We still have this problem that still rises now and then. And Ireland was so dependent upon hoof and mouth related animals for milk and for as its other half of potatoes, that if a famine hit, it could have been disastrous. It could have been disastrous. And so I live in a place here where our agricultural folks who are super smart and super dedicated to our area are talking about the planned obsolescence of our aquifer. So not how do we not use the water that we have to do the best we can, but instead how to deplete it and how fast to deplete it. And whether you want to save some water for children or not is a big part of the conversation. And this is happening across the across the United States right now. We're thinking about Lake Powell. We're thinking about how California is going to get its water, how Colorado is going to get its water. And this means famine. It means at least it'll affect agricultural communities. It'll affect how we all get our food. And until we have food, we need to be thinking about. And so one of the ways that I find Ulysses really interesting to talk about is how, for example, in Nestor, when Nestor says, you know, this is coming, we have this possible way that you're going to cure it. He says, it's an all-important question. In every sense of the word, take the bull by the horns, thanking you for the hospitality of your columns. Foot and mouth disease, known as Cox preparation. And his letter is awful. And it is academic speak to ordinary people. And it will never be read. And I think this is a really important lesson for us as academics to think about, at the same time that it's a really important way for us to interrogate how academics in my area talk to the people who live in my area, who are farmers, who are students, who are, and I think this is one example, but it's not the only example. I'm just trying to focus in on a particular example where I find there's a lot of richness here. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Just as a little footnote to your last comment there, a former colleague of mine discovered that the Irish writer Flann O'Brien had taken the lines from Mr. Deasy's foot and mouth disease letter and fleshed out the rest of the letter based on inference, and then published it in his column Cruiskeen Lawn with a byline of Garrett Deasy. So he takes this fictional character's sort of letter to the editor and inserts it into the archive, which seems like a fascinating and complicated kind of joke. Sean Latham, bring us home if you would.
I will do my best. I'm going to feel super officious now, especially coming after that, because I actually prepared some comments. So I'm going to read them here. So hopefully I don't sound like Deasy prattling on. So in the short amount of time that we've got here, I want to offer two provocative, I hope, but still good reasons to keep reading Ulysses. The first, the easiest, the most practical answer to this is simply that it's my job to keep reading Ulysses. For 2 decades now, I've served as the editor of the James Joyce Quarterly, the flagship journal of the Joyce world. In that time, I've reviewed probably 1,000 essays or so on Ulysses, each of which tries to answer this question: why do we need to keep reading Ulysses? In a new, original, or distinctive ways. That's one of the tests really we have for whether or not to publish something. Is there something new here? We're able to accept only a fraction of what we receive, of course, but I've nevertheless seen waves of critical thought ebb and flow over Joyce's masterwork, some attempting to pull it into their own domains to sort of claim its cultural capital, others seeking to draw back the deep waters around it to reveal some surprising new detail. Historicism, feminism, trans studies, disability studies, critical race theory, food studies, material culture, eco-criticism. These are just a few of the scholarly tides I've seen move in and around Ulysses. The book remains, in other words, what it has always been, essentially an anchor text for the ongoing set of conversations we call literary scholarship. It's worth remembering, after all, that many of the practices that we associate with modern literary studies grew up and through and alongside Ulysses itself. Eliot, Lacan, Cixous, Derrida, Kybert, the list goes on. All of them sought to test their theories against Joyce's novel, like it would only work if they could show that it worked for Ulysses. And that process of testing now teaches us how to find something new in the book on each journey we take through its pages. So yes, it's my job to read Ulysses. That's why I want you to keep reading it, I suppose. To read and listen carefully to why others insist that we have to read the book, to better understand ourselves, our world, and our future. In this, I suppose, we continue to follow Joyce's great object lesson, borrowed from Ezra Pound, right, to make it new. Now, the second reason to read Ulysses may seem obvious, but also easily overlooked. And that's the fact that this is a book about paying attention in a world of distraction. In some ways, I actually find the novel easier to read and to teach now than it has ever been, which is really just a way of saying that I found a new way through its complexity. When I first tackled the book in graduate school, it had an Everest-like quality to it. Why read Ulysses? Well, because it's there, and reading it made you into a scholar. It proved you had chops, grit, determination. While my colleagues seemed to be sipping coffee contentedly in comfy chairs in the library as they submerged themselves in the worlds of Dickens and Austen, a few of us sat there in the library with books arrayed all around us, reading a few sentences of Ulysses, checking a fat book of annotations, glancing at a map of Dublin, confirming a textual variant, then referring knowingly, like mystics or cultists, to the author's secret schemas. It should thus come as no surprise that the first thing I wrote about Ulysses was about snobbery, both as represented in the book as an embodied in that kind of performance of knowledge and superiority that has always marked out readers of Joyce. There's no innocent way to say, oh, I'm just reading Ulysses, as if it was a beach read. I still get a few students who come to Ulysses for the same reason, but not in the numbers I once did, and that actually makes teaching the book a great deal easier. Instead of worrying over much about Homeric parallels and why, for example, the color brown is associated with both Nestor and lotus eaters, it's a lot easier to find the parallels with our own moment. I think this panel plainly illustrates that. Bloom, Stephen, and Molly, after all, find themselves living through deeply polarized political times with the threat of violent revolution, dangerous conspiracy theories, and even world war bubbling dangerously just beneath the surface. Issues of diversity and inclusion mingle with the specter of racism and bigotry, producing often jarring disjunctions. None still more shocking to me than that anti-Semitic song that Stephen cruelly sings in Bloom's home. And there's the citizen, of course, raving in the bar and growling that the time has come to make Ireland great again. What really stands out to me, however, is that all of this takes place amid a backdrop of media penetration and distraction that overwhelms author, character, and reader alike. It takes a great deal of attention to read Ulysses because the book itself can't seem to keep its focus. What we call Bloom's stream of consciousness is really nothing more than, say, your brain on Twitter or Instagram. Stephen does try to focus at times, but even in his protean wanderings on the beach, he can't seem to hold a thought in his head long enough to even complete that vampire poem. One way to read the second half of the book, I would argue, is to see it as an example of the novel itself starting to get distracted, nodding up in an ever-changing array of symbols, leitmotifs, and techne. And in the end, even grammar and punctuation begin to let go, with Molly less some mystical feminine symbol than a mind gripped by nearly terminal distraction. Yes, she famously says, But part of the point is that we have no idea what she's actually affirming. And so the whole epic saga, all this work you've put into the book, collapses into what amounts to something like an ambiguous like. She clicks on before flicking ahead to June 17th. So this is why I think Ulysses is worth reading today. In fact, it's the reason I suppose that the whole cluster of things we call modernism might still matter. The book emerged from within a media revolution that still grips us now, a welter of mutating technologies that have steadily rewired our minds, our cultures, and our democracies by placing ever new and ever more enticing demands on our attention. And for me, Ulysses has now morphed from that Everest-like mountain on a shelf to become a kind of handbook and diagnostic tool, a study of emotion, identity, sexuality, politics, and economics in a state of constant distraction. To this, like Molly, I say yes, I like Ulysses.
Like I said, like I will like. Thank you, Sean. All right, attendees, I know that, like me, you have found these 5 presentations really stimulating, and you're beginning to think about your own questions and your own answers to the question, why read Ulysses 100 years on? So I want to invite you to start putting those questions or the fact of your willingness to ask a question vocally into the chat. And in the meantime, we're going to take a few minutes here to ask our participants to talk to one another. Before I turn to them, though, to invite them to do that, I just want to make one observation, which has sort of been occurring to me as I've been listening, which is that, 1922 is a year in which many works were published, a number of them quite famous, right? It's a year that's often described as the sort of wonder year of modernism. But many of them forgotten or anonymous or under-celebrated. And even among those well-known books, think of Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room, nobody's asking, why read Jacob's Room 100 years on? And so I think it's worth observing that the very question that we're sort of sailing under today is a sort of function of the hyper-canonicity of Ulysses, right? I mean, in a sense, what we're really asking is, should we be supposed to have read Ulysses 100 years on? Why should there be an expectation that a person should have read Ulysses 100 years on? Which is a somewhat different kind of question from why read it at all? And we can try to entangle those questions, or we can prize them apart in our conversation. But I just wanted to put that additional little spin on the question as a way of underscoring the fact that when we're asking that question, we're always, in a sense, grappling with the monumentality and the hyper-canonicity of this book, and whether that status continues to inhere in the ways that it did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. So I would like to invite our participants, if they have comments for one another or observations or questions based on one another's comments, to go ahead and unmute and speak. And maybe what we can do here, since there are not too many of us, and hopefully we're not in such noisy places, if you feel comfortable, panelists, unmuting, and that way maybe there'll be a little bit more flow among the group, members of the group here. And please just go ahead and jump in.
I actually have a question for Bonnie. I was very fascinated by what you were talking about, and I was wondering, what do you, from your reading of Ulysses and Nestor, what do you think Joyce's perspective on academic speech is? Do you think he finds it valuable, or do you think he thinks it's still relevant, or do you think he's mainly playing with it and satirizing it in the book?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things going on here, as there always are, right? I mean, Nestor is pretentious, and I mean the person, not just the chapter. I just mean the figure DZ is pretentious, and nobody likes him, and no one is going to be able to read his writing well in a daily newspaper, partly because of this. And he's also misogynist, to speak to one of the questions here that I'm going to let Mac unpack further. Let you unpack, Mac, further. But he's also, I mean, his explanation for why we, Cassandra foretells the fall of Troy, and she's telling the truth. but Cassandra was just a woman. We should know better than she should be. So he's immediately dismissing sort of qualified voices who are contributing to concerns because they don't meet his sense of who should be able to say these things. And I think academics are not very good. I think academics sometimes shut down conversations rather than having them, I think, when they're hard. And I don't mean because academics don't like hard conversations, but because sometimes it's easier to have those hard conversations in among our own circles where we feel a level of safety rather than talking to, I'm God help me, I'm a parent of soccer kids and I talk a lot with soccer moms. And and there's a certain discussion that there are certain discussions that I don't have with them that I have with my colleagues. I am struggling, especially in a moment that is fraught right now in our nation, to talk to my neighbors. I live in one of the most conservative states and one of the most conservative areas of that state. So the conversations that I have with the people I live with are things that are not like the conversations that I have at school, where I feel confident in my opinions. And as a result, we're not talking at all. And that, I think, is a problem. And I think DZ is pretentious and awful. And I think sometimes people who are pretentious and awful have important things to say and we need to dig through it. And I think Stephen is equally pretentious and awful to his students, not quite as awful as DZ, but equally awful. He's less concerned with teaching them than he is with being superior in the classroom. And I think this is lessons for me as a teacher. And I think in a world where we are being recorded when we say things, that we are nervous about saying the wrong thing and therefore we don't take risks and we don't actually engage in the kind of civic discussions that we need to be having more. I don't know if this is answering your question, but I do think sometimes academics, and I think Ulysses is a great example of this question of why do we have to defend reading Ulysses in a way that maybe we don't have to defend reading Jacob's Room. I think we are in the habit of talking above each other when it comes to a really hard book like Ulysses, rather than talking like I don't know, digging into the text itself and really talking about what we think is happening and what we think is going on. But that's not always true. This is a vast generalization. And so I would hate to, yeah. Okay, I'm done. What do you think, Jack? Tell me what you think. How do you read that chapter?
That's a great question. Turn the tables on me really quick there. So yes, I feel like pretentious and awful is an excellent way to describe DZ there. I'm really thinking, I was really just focusing a lot on what you're talking about with academic speech. And I like what you were saying about having conversations, because I feel like, especially as an English major, like you're pushed to, utilize those communication skills that you're taught, like you're told to be like, speak and talk about all these different things. And you're right. I feel like I have a certain comfort in my classes that I can speak with my professors and like my fellow English majors. But sometimes when I go out with and open up the same sort of discussions, or if someone asks me how my day was and I want to bring up a discussion that was brought up, in our classes, like I hesitate to give all of the details because I feel like it'll open up a can of worms that I don't want to get into. And I feel like there is a very discomforting part of the art of conversation that I think a lot of us try and avoid on most occasions. I would say like I do a lot of occasions. And I wonder if Joyce is really just with this Nestor chapter, with having DZ there, like is trying to push us to be like, maybe we need to sit through the hard conversations or sit through the things that make us uncomfortable or bore us to death, maybe in some ways. Like it's not necessarily interesting sometimes the way DZ was writing. So yeah, that's where I stand. I don't necessarily know if that answered my question as well, but I appreciate the conversation that you put forth.
What do the rest of you think? What have you taken from this chapter? It doesn't have to be this chapter. Tell me what you're thinking about in your chapters.
So Oxnam of the Sun is the chapter that I spent the most time with this semester. And in terms of like Joyce just trying to show off, that's really what a lot of Oxnam felt like to me, as he's like rewriting this like evolution of the English language from like pre-English, like like Latin translations up through like very like contemporary slang. And I think initially when reading, because I probably read it 2 or 3 times, when I first read through Oxnam, I was like, oh gosh, I don't know what happened. And it really felt hard to get down to like the plot and like what Joyce wanted to say, because it felt like there were so many layers of him like trying to like exert this like literary dominance. But I think like as I went through it, like Oxnam clearly became one of my favorite chapters. And I think that's just like something that I don't always know like what Joyce is doing. Like to what extent is like his choosing a different style for every single chapter really just like him trying to like show off, or is it like adding to the substance of the book? And I think in Oxen, in which like a lot of like the plot is Mina giving birth, like I think the like parallel between like the evolution of like the human embryo and like the evolution of language like is a really cool thing. But I don't necessarily know if like that was that needed for me to get down to the substance. So that's definitely something I wrestle with in terms of how academic or Joyce has to be in Ulysses. I don't know if that helps.
But I love this because one of the things, I will let you in, I'm sorry, Megan, I can see you. I love the fact that the way you got at that story is the idea that of Joyce maybe representing woman's disempowerment over her own body, which I find really fascinating, because I also find him in other places, including that chapter, to be so pro-life that it allows us to have a conversation that I don't usually have with my students about current politics. And that this is one of those chapters that I sit here and I go back and forth. And so the question becomes both, what does Joyce mean? And then also, what do we think about what we think Joyce might have meant? And I love that about the way that you introduced that chapter.
Yeah, I will 100% agree. Jordan so powerfully. I have to say this. Jordan wrote this amazing paper where she presented a cover letter and a CV or resume with Mina Purefoy's labor and all of the labor that she has done spelled out, unremunerated in any way, and then trying to apply for a job at Planned Parenthood, where she hoped that then she would be paid for advising women about contraception. And it's true that at a Catholic university, we are told, actually, usually not to talk about abortion, and contraception is fair game. And Jordan just blasted in there, and this was her reading of the chapter, and we were gonna have that conversation. And it was amazing. There were different points of view. It was clear to me in the classroom, but I was excited that we could have that. And Joyce did bring us to that place. So thank you, Jordan. I also wondered if I could pivot to you or to any of the panelists, the question that was asked me in the chat, or about how we balance that with the moments of terrible misogyny in the text. So how you know, the traditional reading maybe that, which I wouldn't disagree with either, that Molly might be the only voice that we hear, and she's stuck in a bed all day and thinking about sex. And that's, you know, where is the intellectual woman's mind in this book? Where do we find her? Why is she so embodied? And what would be another example of misogyny in this text? It's hard, there are so many. Maybe we'll look to poor Gertie McDowell and the way she thinks. And if her mind is only a male projection, is that the only other female mind is a male projection? So I wondered if I could pivot that question to you all about what you do with the misogyny in the text.
I want to defer to others, so I don't mean to. This won't quite answer your question either. I don't think. I've been sitting here thinking about conversation, because one of the things that's weird, and I think I'll circle around to kind of answer this question sideways. One of the things that strikes me about Ulysses is, and especially in the terms of us having this initial conversation about conversations, is, you know, it's not a book in which people talk very much at all. right? The thing that's interesting about this is a book for introverts, right? It turns out everybody gets to have super interesting internal lives. We get to follow Bloom's life, Molly's life. They don't talk to very many people at all during the day. The one frank conversation Bloom arguably has during the day nearly gets him punched in the mouth, right, by the citizen. So this is not a book for frankness. He and Buck are constantly lying to each other to set up the whole book, right? Am I going to sleep here tonight? Who's going to get the key? Who's paying the rent? Like this is the art of not having a conversation and of keeping secrets from each other. This whole book is about keeping secrets. Molly falls asleep convinced Bloom has been out sleeping around or doing something. He's lying to her, right? She says, well, it's fine. I've been lying to him all day too. This is a book in which no one communicates honestly with one another, but we feel it's a book all about honesty because we get to live inside these people's heads for a while. And I think the thing that makes it a sort of work of genius, at least in terms of what was your term, Paul? Hypercanonicity. The thing that makes it so great as a book to teach, right? That it can let us do all this stuff, is that Joyce is really canny about how he sets this up, so that there's always a layer between us and the character. So we can never really accuse Joyce of misogyny, right? We can accuse the text of misogyny, right? I mean, my reading of Gertie McDowell in some ways is that's not a misogynist text at all. This is Joyce sort of constructing this, and this isn't really my argument. It's Andrew Gibson's, right? Gertie is somebody who's constructing, using the languages of fantasy that have been given to her by women's magazines to construct something like a liberated idea of self, right? When you're so impoverished in the stories that you're able to tell about yourself, Gertie manages to use some impoverished materials to tell a fantasy about how her life might be better, right? And that's an empowering sort of process to go through. That's the work of fiction. In some ways, it's the work of teaching. It's just that Gertie McDowell doesn't get to go to school, right? She, like Dilly, is at best can go pick up a secondhand, used primer and try to get the kind of education that Stephen has. So I don't know if that quite answers the question about misogyny, other than one reason we can talk around that question is because Joyce has always got these other layers, the techne, the schema, a sense of irony about everything, right down to making sure that, as I said in my comments, Stephen sings that horrible anti-Semitic song to the man that's invited him in off the street, who he knows is Jewish, and he knows this is an offensive act, probably one of the more offensive acts he can commit against this guy. But Joyce says, oh, don't worry, that's irony. That's not Joyce being anti-Semitic, right? That's Stephen. He's always, so I'm not Stephen. Look at all the layers I've built up. It's a pretty deft act that I don't think we see in a lot of other, even modernist texts that are obsessed with irony. Joyce keeps adding more and more layers that help us dodge around some of these questions and thus can make the book feel always attentive to the present moment, I think. That's a terrible job of answering your question, but I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But maybe to turn back to Quinn's question, because Gertie's one of those figures who I find so fascinating and I wonder what you think about this, Quinn, because I struggle with the fact that she thinks she has the most beautiful legs in the world, which I don't want to take away from her, but also these are legs that she's lame too, right? So it's such an interesting paradox that the part of her body that she finds the most beautiful is also the part that is disabled. And I'm curious in terms of, we can talk about objectification, we can talk about, women's ideals and legs as being one of them, but I'm just curious about this.
Yeah, I think that definitely ties into the question of misogyny in the text, that Gertie's own view of herself, like this, the main way that she kind of conceptualizes her own desire and desirability is through her legs, and like Bloom's immediate reaction upon her getting up off the swing is to think, oh, she's lame, and kind of thinking about how that would have impacted his own desire. And I think the question I have is, why is it a paradox? Mm-hmm. And is disability always going to, like, does it always mean undesirability? And I think, like, in leading us along in this very extended scene and kind of having this reveal, Joyce is also kind of asking us to examine, our own standards of what makes people desirable and like what we consider to be beautiful, and like what systems are kind of shaping that, if that makes sense.
I wonder whether Mac and or Jordan want to speak to the question of misogyny, although in a sense both of you already have in your opening comments. But do you want to pick up on any of the threads that have been in the last couple of comments?
Sure. I wanted to comment on Sean's idea of like Joyce's sense of irony, because so I read this book this semester in a class that was primarily women, except for one guy that sat right next to me, who was great. But I think what was awesome about that perspective is that, yes, I saw that there were misogynistic aspects of the male characters and the way they thought about women. But because I was sitting in a class with women, I just felt like it was more of a time, like I felt like Joyce was creating this book to almost make fun of the patriarchy, because they looked ridiculous saying what they were saying and doing what they were doing. Like in Nausicaa with the Gertie McDowell scene, like his orgasm is like paired with like a firework at the same time, like in like a very ridiculous way that was kind of like, I felt like was supposed to be meant to be humorous as well. And it's like, it also, going back to what Quinn was discussing with desirability, like it is ridiculous that he was like, oh, she's lame, but he literally just got off to her. Like, how does that change how does that change how desirable that she was, that now she's, limping off the beach instead of, I don't know, skipping. So I guess from my perspective, I see that misogyny, but I see that as more of what Sean was saying. Like, I see it as ironic. Like, I feel like it's something to be made fun of and to comment on the patriarchy and how maybe those male characters think and be like, oh, that's absolutely ridiculous. Like, I can't believe that we see them that way. Like, I know our class, like throughout our discussions, like had very varying, like had a lot of different opinions on both Stephen and Bloom as we went through, like Stephen being the man that tends to have more of like an angel whore complex, and Bloom going from like the seemingly empathetic guy to being like the guy that stares at, other women's asses and then finally goes into, jerking off to a younger woman. And I feel like we are able to just be like, comment on his own morality and be like, oh, that's not the best, but like also, pick apart and see what's wrong with that and work from there to see how we could improve from there. So I feel like it's just more of like painting of what exists within the patriarchy in terms of misogyny, and making fun of it. I don't know. I see it as kind of like more of not a joking matter, but definitely more ironic. That was a little all over the place. I apologize.
That was wonderful, Mac. Jordan, did you want to get in here?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add about to the Gertie McDowell conversation is how much it confuses me. Like the idea of the projected mirage and whether or not I do think that she is just all made up in Bloom's head, because specifically it is like her leg, which like Bloom she believes, I'm sorry, these keep turning off. It is her leg, which like she believes is like very sexualized, but it's also Bloom, like his like staring at her leg. And I guess I just get caught up in the circles of, oh, if Bloom is imagining her, then he's imagining her with a disability, and then he's imagining her with a disability that he's attracted to, but then he's imagining himself being also repulsed by that and being like, so I think we had a long conversation in class, like as to whether or not like we do think Gertie is like a real woman, like with a mind of her own, or if she is just a part of Bloom's mind. And I don't come down, I think, on either side of that. And I think like with that very like piece is like what leads me to such confusion. But I do think there is, when we were talking about a way of like reading the scene like in a more positive light, like with like through a disability studies lens, I think it does seem very important that it is like her very disability that like makes her feminine, that makes her a sexual being, like rather than like this very like ableist like lens that often like makes like disabled characters like asexual, or like this like idea that like having a disability means that you don't also have sexual desire. That felt very important to like our reading of it, like in a possibly like positive way.
I think implicit in the question why read Ulysses 100 years on is a little bit the implication that that a book that replicates oppression, inequality, contradiction is something to stay away from. But this conversation is actually reminding me of a line in a recent book by a couple of my colleagues at Penn, Aaron Levy and Lindsay Hoy, in which they write that the arts are essential in visualizing society's contradictions, inequalities, and forms of oppression, right? Not in wishing them away or in delivering a kind of utopian image of a better world, although that's obviously another thing that art can do, but in helping us to visualize contradiction, inequality, and forms of oppression, and to give us some purchase, some analytical purchase and some aesthetic purchase in thinking about those problems so that we can attach ourselves to them in order to solve them. And I think that's been maybe a kind of undercurrent of these last set of exchanges. I don't know if the panelists have been looking at the chat, but a number of the comments are quite complimentary, particularly to our student participants. And I just want you to know that that's happening. Jam Conway writes, the students' perspectives show me, besides or because of teaching me something new about a text I've studied so much, how relevant and important it is 100 years on. And there are a couple of other comments sort of along those lines that I just want you to know are happening there. Maybe we can turn now to take up a question from E. Cunniff. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. How can Ulysses help us understand ideas, pros and cons about nationalism in 2022, since we've been focused on gender, disability, maybe to change gears a little bit and think about nation, nationalism, particularly in the context of our own moment in which we've seen such a strong resurgence of ethno-nationalist sentiment, not just here in the States, but abroad. You know, underwriting a quite devastating war right now in Ukraine. Does anyone want to take that up?
I mean, I suppose I can just say this is one of those, when I talk about the currents that have flowed around Ulysses, that is one of those interesting currents to me. That, and I think, you know, Paul, you and I are, I think, exactly the same vintage, right? Bonnie and Megan, pretty close. Like, we were here for this moment. I mean, it was a vivid moment for me when sort of Irish studies sort of suddenly swamped Ulysses, right? That reclaiming this as an Irish text, it had been held at arm's length by the Irish for a long time. And there were these post-colonial readings reclaiming the citizen as in important ways as a sort of character trying to articulate a sort of nationalist philosophy in the midst of colonization, and that this was an important and overlooked component to the book that was too easily collapsed under a kind of Bloomian liberalism that had grown up in the immediate aftermath of World War II and had become a sort of staple of American Cold War liberal politics. And now all of a sudden, you know, nationalism is this increasingly toxic thing again, and it's raising all kinds of questions about all that historical work we did reclaiming Ulysses as a post-colonial text to sort of then now ask about these toxic elements of nationalism that scholars worked for a while to reclaim or at least rethink, and that now, you know, I yearn for the simplicity of Bloom's Cold War liberalism, right? It feels comforting to me, but maybe it was Joyce's sort of honesty about the fact that these nationalist impulses, right, they have centuries long, millennia long histories here. They're not a thing that gets solved by people living together in the same place or apart in other places, right? Whatever that Bloom's failed attempt to articulate a nation.
That's great, Sean. Bonnie, you have spoken about you know, the frequency with which you are having hard conversations with neighbors, friends, fellow parents who have really different political persuasions. Do you find anything about Ulysses helps equip you for those conversations as opposed to just being an object that's very difficult to discuss in those kinds of contexts?
Yes, I would say, first of all, I think that and this will not be news to anyone in the panel, but I think the Citizen is, of course, our icon of nationalism, and probably the only, I find even Deasy, even Buck Mulligan to be very well-rounded characters when read carefully. I do not find that in the Citizen. I find him to be not only one-eyed, but also in his description, one-sided. I don't see any other like backups for him. And I find him to be a sort of, I think one of the things that I find so useful about Joyce in thinking about questions is kind of the way that Joyce is advocating for Irishness at the same time he's not in Ireland, the way that he's advocating for ideals about Irishness without going back and learning the language, and he's moving forward, thinking forward rather than trying to recuperate a past. That the plurality of the way he thinks when he claims Irish literature, but he also claims English literature, but he also claims all of these other kinds of great literatures, and that pluralism becomes his authorial answer to these problems, but that I think that he sees in the Citizen as a very, as the one figure, the one-sided real danger, the only person who threatens Bloom with violence, that this is a problem. And I think that he thinks that while he mocks things like, Kathleen New Houlihan in something like the old woman who brings milk to Buck and to Haynes and to Stephen in the very beginning of Telemachus, and while he's concerned about what I would call that entire chapter thinking about affirmation bias, and he's concerned about that it's nationalism that has his bigger concern. And I think, yeah, he's somebody who thinks Ireland is important, so it's not like make America great again or make Ireland great again. It's also make the world great, and we'll be part of that greatness. And I think that as a post-colonial author, Joyce has to think about Ireland, and that it's got to be an important part of his discussion, but it cannot be done alone. It cannot be done without thinking about all of these contributing factors, and that these other contributing factors are now part of that history and part of that culture. And that one of the beauties of his writing is that he doesn't reject those other contributions. Tell me what you all think. I ramble, sorry.
You're great, Bonnie. Any other takers on this one? Nationalism?
I would just follow up. I see this comment in the chat here from E, kind of the Ireland is important, but Europe matters too, right? That was definitely Joyce's vibe, right? Like Joyce wanted to be a European as much as he wanted to be Irish, and his he always said the sort of Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sort of Europe, I guess a sort of European Union of its day, was his sort of ideal of what, of how a nation might function, what he called a ramshackle empire, right? This thing that could kind of barely hold itself together, could accommodate lots of language and ethnicities, didn't seem like a particularly hazardous kind of nationalism compared to some of the other ones he was seeing on the continent. Of course, Joyce never claimed Irish citizenship, never sought French citizenship, right? Despite that Paris, Trieste, Zurich, he ended up a British citizen of all things throughout his entire life.
One of the debates that I think was nibbling around the edges of Ulysses, although it's not an event that's depicted directly in Ulysses, was the centenary of the Easter Rebellion in 1916, 6 years back. And there's one reading of Easter 1916, which is a moment of sacrifice that makes Irish nationhood inevitable. But there's another kind of emergent reading of 1916 that understands it as a moment of real uncertainty in which, Ireland could have been looking at a different kind of future political form than the nation state, could have been looking at something more open, something more left-wing, for instance, than the vision of nationhood that was promulgated by the people who made the Declaration of Statehood in 1916. So, it's a question, I think, for the next 100 years of a study of Ulysses, whether this is in fact a book that understands Irish nationhood to be inevitable, as a number of Joyceans, living and prominent Joyceans have claimed, right? That it's a book published on the cusp of Irish nationhood, or whether it's a kind of encyclopedia of alternative political futures, only one of which transpired. I want to bring in by voice Bluma Hammerhead, who has indicated a question in the chat. So Ed, could I ask you to unmute Bluma? Bluma,
Hi,
are you
everyone.
there?
Can you hear me?
Great. Thanks.
I'm a senior in high school, and I am having my first encounter with Ulysses. And it's really hard, and I'm often asking myself, like, why am I doing this? And I guess I'm interested on a more personal level, why all of you came to Ulysses, and especially those of you who have continued to study it. Why do you keep coming back to this text?
Megan, do you want to start this one?
Oh, goodness. During the nationalism question, I was trying to find the line in the book. I had one of those weird moments where the book sometimes feels mystical. You know, that happens with both Finnegan's Wake and Joyce, and I avoid that. But the day I was teaching this chapter, there was the line, Russia will march over all countries. Do you remember I put it in a handout? It was very strange timing, the same day that Russia invaded Ukraine. So it does seem like this book has sometimes comments on everything. But thank you for your question, a personal one. That's hard. Why do we keep reading? Why do we return to them? I think probably I would say I am always brought back to, I was looking at was it Bersani today, who was talking about Joyce flirting with sentimentalism all the time in the text, and yet then cutting it off. And the ways that, I mean, think of at the end of Circe, and Rudy appears, and it breaks my heart. I don't know how we can, when I first saw that, and I thought, oh my gosh, after I've made it through this play of changing sexuality, and it's a circus, and I don't know where anyone is, and why is Bella, and then all of a sudden Rudy is there, and there's this moment of, you just know this father misses his son. And I think the way that the text is constantly allowing you sentimentality, but then checking it through rhetoric, through style, through questioning that sentimentality, for me always lures me back in. It makes me want to turn to it again and say, does that moment work for me again? Does it still have the same impact? So I think for me that might be, it's the sometimes contrast, sometimes skipping hand in hand of the styles with what the book is talking about. I hope that works. Anyone else wanna try that one?
Yeah, I think, Megan, I really feel very much the same about Ulysses. My first read through, I was just struck again and again by these little pieces of like sudden really deep pain or regret, or longing that just kind of move along in the march of thoughts that is the entire text. And I feel like for me, that's really just a part of how life is. Like it feels sentimental, but I think at the same time, we all have these losses and experiences that we just kind of carry, and in brief moments, we'll see something that reminds us of someone who has died, and that grief can just kind of like flash up and then go, kind of back to where it was being held. And that is something that's really moved me about the text. And on a lighter note, I think that there's just so much detail written into it, and it's really a lot of fun to keep diving in and trying to find all of these little secrets and jokes.
Luma, I love your question, and I'm grateful to you for asking it. And also want to say, I tried to read Ulysses by myself in high school and just completely bounced off of it and gave up after, there were some guys in a tower, but it was the 20th century, like what was going on? So it's wonderful that you're wrestling with this book. Quinn, your words about how a fragment of this book can kind of cause something to flash up remind me of one of my favorite moments, which is in the Hades episode, the graveyard chapter, and it's just after Patty Dignam's coffin has been lowered into the ground and has disappeared from view, and there's a pause, and then Bloom thinks, if we were all suddenly somebody else. And in a sense, it's a kind of, it's a generic thing to say about a work of fiction, right? Which allows us the chance to imagine that we're all suddenly somewhere else, somebody else, or that we have access to the experience of other people. But I think that this book goes to the next level and imagines not only that we were, it enables us to imagine not only that we're other individuals, but that we might see reality through a whole succession of different frames, different metaphors, different heuristics, different languages, different codes. And so there's something about that moment, which happens, at a moment of kind of spareness, right? The coffin has disappeared into the earth, and then there's this explosion of plenitude. And this book feels to me like an explosion of plenitude at a moment of burial. If you think about it, it's being, published after the First World War, during which it was written, published at a time of mass death and of massive uncertainty and social change. And yet to be able to sort of ask at that moment if we were all suddenly somebody else, if everything suddenly worked by a set of different rules, is so inspiring. I'm mindful of time, and I might turn to Jennifer Joyce's question. Thank you so much to all of the participants, very enlightening. What struck me most in listening was the thematic organizational method of the presentation in the context of 2022, issues of gender, disability, agriculture, pandemics, social media, et cetera. So Jennifer's indexing the things that you all spoke about in your opening remarks. I know that so many courses teach chapter by chapter. If you were to teach, or if you were to take or teach a Ulysses at 100 years course structured by theme, what additional relevant themes might show up on a syllabus in addition to the ones you've discussed? Or what would you like to give attention to that perhaps scholars would not have considered in the past other than what was shared today? So it's really a question about, like, what is nobody talking about? Or what has nobody here yet talked about that you would like to surface in respect to Ulysses? And thank you, Jennifer, for that great question.
I would love to hear some things on affirmation bias. I would love to hear some things on fake news with the Aeolus chapter. I would love to hear some things on trans issues with Circe, to give you a few more.
And Bonnie, just to let you log roll for a minute, are you going to be addressing any of those in your upcoming podcast?
I am going to try. This is the hope. I cannot tell people exactly what to do with their podcast, but I will be pushing to see some of these issues come up, and also CRT, right? Which is what I want to talk about with Stephen's teaching. Why it is
critical race theory, is that the CRT you're referring to?
Say again.
Critical race theory?
Yes, I apologize.
Okay,
yes, critical race theory.
I added in addiction and alcoholism. I feel like that this time reading through, it just seemed like we were constantly talking about men sitting in a bar getting drunk the entire time. And what we do with that, what it says about their entrapment in a certain society, but how it.
I guess I don't know if this is definitely not like something that no one has said before, but I would definitely say like grief and closure, especially with regard, excuse me, sorry. My bad. Especially with regard, I was thinking of the passage in Circe when Stephen is speaking with his mother and trying to reconcile with her in some ways and be like, I didn't kill you, cancer did. But she doesn't really answer that. She's just like, repent, Stephen, and repent and be better, I guess, in some ways. So I guess he doesn't really get an answer. And how do you deal with grief? How do you deal with unfinished arguments or conversations that you don't get to have with people that have left this world? So yeah, I would add grief and closure to that list as well.
I suppose my answer would come off of what I've already said about social media, but I think play and playfulness is one of the things that actually makes Ulysses interesting. It is clearly a game scholars play among themselves. And I don't mean play or game at all in sort of demeaning ways, but play is the sort of opposite, not of work, but of boredom, right? This is a way to occupy our minds. It's a book all about how minds get occupied with both things that are pleasurable and unpleasurable, which are all part of feedback systems within games. I think the whole new set of sort of philosophies and sort of scholarship that's growing up around how games actually work can tell us a lot about why we keep coming back to Ulysses, why I would bother to read 1,000 essays on the same book. There are a lot of other books I could have spent my life reading, right? But there is something about that sense of being part of a game that makes Ulysses. It's this community that we see on our screen here. That's part of what makes Ulysses worth doing. It's not finding some weird thing yourself. It's finding it as part of a group and sort of playing your way through what you found with others.
Sean, you've written about Finnegan's Wake and game play, haven't you?
Yeah.
Just a wonderful piece. And so, it seems to me that you're the person to fill the remit that you've just maybe made, and to think about Ulysses and the ludic and gamification. In the class of mine and Rob Barry's that Quinn took, students worked in groups to do kind of creative critical final projects, and two students worked together to put together basically a side scroller video game based on Ulysses, which is fantastic. And if there's time, I'll put the URL into the chat so people can check it out.
Love that.
Others want to get in on this? What is nobody talking about, or what have we not yet talked about with respect to Ulysses?
I would probably highlight something that we just haven't talked about yet that I would probably highlight is just like parenthood in general in the text, which goes hand in hand with like Mac's theme of like grief and loss. And I think because we even get highlights of like Bloom's parents, like we get we see characters that have lost parents. And I think a question I think a lot about in my own personal life is how much the people that raise us, or the people that we call our home community, have affected who we are now. And I think this idea of loss of Stephen looking for a parent replacement in a way, or Bloom trying to fill that replacement, and how actually attainable it is to replace a parent, is a question that I would be curious to think more about.
Thank you, Jordan. There's some wonderful responses from attendees to the question, why are you reading Ulysses 100 years later? Joseph Lennon writes, wonderful conversation, great to hear and see you all. For me, I continue to read the text because it reveals so much about 1904 and the 1920s Ireland. Also, I love the layers of the text, the beauty and ironies of the language, and the insights into how people, particularly men, think and thought. And Margareta Noonan writes, I'll echo Quinn's comment about why I keep returning. There's always something more to see, to understand whenever smart people come together to talk about this book, including tonight with these marvelous panelists. I think maybe with that, we should wind things up since we're getting close to time. And Megan, maybe I'll turf it over to you to bring us home, since this panel really was Megan's brainchild, and Megan has been the prime mover behind it since that twinkle in the eye.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I can wrap up this. I feel so grateful. And I will say that teaching two of these wonderful students this semester really brought home to me why we do read it. And I loved something, Paul, you said earlier about something about the many layers and how it forces you to think and rethink a conversation. And I will remember that moment that Jordan was talking about, where we couldn't decide if it was a projected mirage and what that meant to ableist thinking. And we kept building on each other until we were like 16 layers above. It was, if it was a projected layer, if it was projected vision at that moment, but he imagined his desire as enabled by a disabled body, then isn't that yet again a surprise? And we just kept building on ourselves. So I'm so grateful for teaching it. I had two small quotations, one from a reviewer of Ulysses in the Sporting Times in 1922, where he said the book appears to have been written by a perverted, and then he used the word lunatic, but I want to use lunacy there carefully. I still think there are moments where you think about that and wonder what perversion is and what we mean by perversion. And then Ezra Pound says, we have to unite to give praise to Ulysses, and it's coming from Pound. So there again, we're trapped in those layers. So I'd like to thank all of you for tonight, for thinking through these questions with me. Hope to see some of you maybe at Bloomsday at the Rosenbach, or at some of our Irish Studies events, or at Rosenbach classes too. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Megan, Paul, Sean, Bonnie, Jordan, Quinn, Mac.
Thank you.
This was really great. And thank you in the audience for attending tonight. We bring this program to you for free. So if you would like to support the Rosenbach, either by donation or becoming a member, you can do so by visiting our website. Your support helps us care for our collections and helps us bring more programs like this one to you. And all of you who participated tonight, thank you. I mean, to take time out right now at the end of your semester, I know is, a lot for all of you. And we really appreciate the support you guys give to the Rosenbach and doing a program like this. I've had a great pleasure working with Paul and Megan over the years. And thank you all, the rest of you, for joining in that too. I hope to see everyone at another of our Ulysses Centenary programs, and also our Bloomsday celebration on June 16th in person at the Rosenbach in Philadelphia. Thank you, everyone, and good night. Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you.
Cheers. Good night.